Welcome to Void of Rules. I was just looking at my channel analytics, and a shocking 85.5% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying these stories, consider hitting that subscribe button to help me reach 1K subscribers by the end of the year. It costs absolutely nothing, takes just 1 second, and you can always change your mind later. Drop a like on the video too. It really helps with the algorithm. Now let's jump into today's story. The posting seemed innocuous enough. Telephone booth attendant needed, night shift, good pay. Simple, direct, and exactly what I needed after I'd been laid off from my IT job in Denver. The severance package had run dry, and my landlord's patience was wearing thinner than the soles of my only pair of decent shoes. I'm Daniel Graves, 32, and I never thought I'd end up working in what amounted to a glass box in the middle of nowhere. But desperation has a way of making the unusual seem reasonable, and my bank account had been flashing warning signs for weeks now. The electricity bill sat unpaid on my kitchen counter, and I'd been living on ramen and tap water for longer than I cared to admit. The interview was held in a nondescript office building on the outskirts of Denver. The receptionist didn't look up when I entered, just pointed to a narrow hallway with peeling wallpaper. At the end, a door labelled Mountain Communications stood slightly ajar. The manager, a thin man with hollowed cheeks and eyes that never quite met mine, spoke in a monotone that made me wonder if he was medicated. His suit hung from his frame, as if it belonged to someone else, someone larger, who had slowly withered away inside it. "The job is simple, Mr. Graves. Maintain the booth, answer calls, follow the rules." He slid a leather-bound book across the desk. It looked ancient, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. "This contains everything you need to know." I nodded, trying to appear enthusiastic about what sounded like mind-numbing work. "What kind of calls come in?" "Emergencies. Various types, mostly directions, occasionally emergencies." His fingers tapped an irregular rhythm on the desktop. "The booth serves as a communication point for a remote area. Service is unpredictable in the mountains." "And hours?" 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. I did some quick mental math. 10 hours a night didn't sound great, but the isolation meant I could probably catch some sleep if calls were infrequent. "The pay is deposited weekly, in cash." He named a figure that made my eyebrows rise involuntarily. It was nearly double what I'd been making in IT. "When do I start?" "Tonight." He slid a map across the table, a red X marking a spot deep in the mountains, and a set of keys. Our meeting was over before it had really begun, leaving me with more questions than answers. But the promise of cash, immediate, substantial cash, silenced the warning bells ringing faintly in the back of my mind. The drive took longer than expected. The highway gave way to state roads, which surrendered to unmarked mountain passes that twisted through dense pine forests. My old Honda protested the steep inclines, the check engine light flickering on as the shadows lengthened across the valley. The booth stood alone on a patch of gravel just off a seldom-used mountain road. The nearest town was 15 miles east, according to my GPS, which had lost signal about 20 minutes prior. The closest neighbour, according to the manager, was a ranger station 5 miles west. Pine trees surrounded the small clearing, their tops swaying against the darkening sky as I pulled up. The booth itself looked like it had been plucked from a 1950s street corner and dropped unceremoniously in the wilderness. Glass panels, aluminum frame, a blue telephone sign illuminated from within. It seemed absurdly out of place among the towering pines and rugged mountain backdrop, like finding a vending machine at the bottom of the ocean. I sat in my car for several minutes, the engine ticking as it cooled, gathering the courage to begin what was arguably the strangest job I'd ever taken. The sun had already disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple. Stars were emerging, brighter and more numerous than I'd ever seen in the city. Inside the booth was just enough room for a small desk, a chair, and the telephone equipment. The phone itself was a vintage model, not quite rotary, but definitely pre-digital, with a handset that felt substantial in my grip. A small space heater hummed in the corner, and a battery-powered lamp provided additional light to supplement the dim glow from the booth's overhead fixture. The space was meticulously clean. No dust, no cobwebs, not even fingerprints on the glass. It smelled faintly of pine cleaner and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something old, like library books or antique shops. I settled in and opened the rulebook. The pages were yellowed, the text a mix of printed guidelines and handwritten additions. Some notes were scribbled in margins, others crossed out and rewritten. The handwriting varied significantly from page to page, as if multiple people had contributed over time. Rule 1. Never answer calls between 3:12 a.m. and 3:16 a.m. Rule 2. If phone rings twice in quick succession, let it go to voicemail. Rule 3. If caller asks for the operator, hang up immediately. Rule 4. Once per shift, a call from unknown number will come. Don't answer, but listen for breathing. If you hear breathing, leave the booth for exactly 5 minutes. Rule 5. Keep the booth clean at all times. Rule 6. Never leave the booth unattended for more than 5 minutes. Rule 7. Don't speak to anyone who approaches the booth after midnight. Rule 8. If the lights flicker 3 times, close your eyes for 30 seconds. I chuckled to myself, the sound strangely muted in the small space. Classic hazing for the new guy. Make him believe in ghost stories and jump at shadows. I'd played similar pranks at my old office, convincing an intern that our server room was haunted by the ghost of a programmer who died debugging a particularly nasty piece of code. Still, the specificity was impressive. 3:12 to 3:16 a.m. was an oddly narrow window. Why not just say don't answer after 3 a.m. or something similarly broad? And the instruction to leave for exactly 5 minutes, not approximately, but exactly, had a peculiar precision to it. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I checked my watch. 8:47 p.m. Colorado Mountain telephone booth, this is Daniel speaking. How may I help you? Oh, thank goodness, a woman's voice came through, slightly breathless. My car broke down about 2 miles up the mountain road. I've been walking trying to find help, but there's no cell service. I scrambled for a pen. I can call a tow truck for you. Can you describe exactly where you are? After taking down her information and making a call to the nearest service station in town, I settled back in my chair. Purpose filled me. Maybe this job wasn't so pointless after all. People in trouble needed this booth. It was a lifeline in an isolated area. The first night passed mostly like that. A few calls came in, mostly lost hikers or drivers needing directions. Around 2 a.m, an elderly woman called asking about the old road. I'm trying to get to Blackwater Hollow, her voice quavered slightly. Is the old road still passable? I explained I was just the booth attendant and didn't know the area well. I've only just started this job tonight. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. Oh, you're new then? There was a strange pause. Well, you take care up there. Follow those rules they gave you. Before I could ask how she knew about the rules, she thanked me and hung up. The rest of the night passed without incident. As dawn approached, I watched the sky lighten from black to deep blue to pale lavender. Birds began their morning chorus, and I locked up the booth with a strange reluctance. Despite its isolation and the odd rules, the booth had been peaceful, a glass island in a sea of wilderness. By sunrise, I was bored but richer. As I drove home to my apartment, I wondered why the job paid so well for doing so little. But the weight of cash in my pocket silenced my questions for the time being. My second night started with the confidence of a veteran. I brought a paperback novel, a thermos of coffee, and a sandwich. The booth felt less strange now, almost cozy with the heater running against the autumn mountain chill. I'd even brought a small cushion for the chair. I opened the rulebook again, this time noticing details I'd missed before. Beneath Rule 4 was a small note: they can hear you through the static. Under Rule 7 was a warning: they are not people after midnight. I dismissed these as more elaborate hazing. Whoever had this job before me clearly had too much time on their hands and a vivid imagination. A few calls trickled in before midnight. Nothing unusual. A lost hiker. A driver with a flat tire asking about the nearest service station. A couple wanting to know if a particular campsite was open year-round. I answered them professionally, helped where I could, and returned to my book, a dog-eared copy of Stephen King's The Stand that seemed appropriate given my isolated surroundings. At 1:37 a.m, the phone rang. It stopped after 2 rings, then immediately rang again. 2 rings, in quick succession. Rule 2 flashed in my mind, but I dismissed it. These rules were obviously nonsense, probably written by bored attendants to frighten their replacements. I picked up the receiver. Colorado Mountain telephone booth. How may I direct your call? Static crackled through the line, soft and persistent like radio interference. I was about to hang up when a voice whispered through the static. It was barely audible, as if coming from very far away. You shouldn't have answered. The line went dead. Simultaneously, the temperature in the booth plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me despite the heater running at full blast. Condensation formed on the glass walls, droplets running together to form unusual patterns that almost resembled script in a language I'd never seen. I stood up quickly, knocking over my coffee. The hot liquid pooled on the floor, steam rising to fog the glass further. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned slowly to look out at the surrounding forest. The moon had risen, casting pale light through the trees. That's when I saw it, a dark figure standing motionless among the distant pines. Tall, too tall to be a hiker, and completely still. It seemed to be facing the booth, though I couldn't make out any features at that distance. I blinked, and it was gone. My hands trembled as I cleaned up the spilled coffee. I told myself it was the caffeine, or the isolation, or the power of suggestion from those stupid rules. The figure was probably just a shadow cast by the moonlight through the trees. The voice on the phone was likely just static that my brain had interpreted as words, a common psychological phenomenon. The remainder of the night passed with excruciating slowness. Every creak of the booth, every whisper of wind through the pines, set my nerves on edge. Each time the phone rang, my hand hesitated before reaching for it. By dawn, I had convinced myself it was all imagination fueled by those ridiculous rules and the eerie isolation of the booth. The mind plays tricks when you are alone, in the dark. But as I locked up the booth, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent my daylight hours researching the area on my laptop. The telephone booth wasn't marked on any official maps, and I could find no record of mountain communications in any business database. The address where I'd had my interview led to an empty office building when I drove past it. The check I'd received for my first night's work had cleared without issue, however, appearing in my account as a deposit from MCT Holdings. That night, my third, I arrived early. The sun hadn't quite set, and the booth looked less imposing in the golden light of early evening. I did a perimeter check, examining the ground around the booth for footprints or any sign of the figure I'd seen. Nothing but undisturbed pioneer needles and mountain soil. Inside, I noticed something odd. The rulebook was slightly out of place, rotated about 45 degrees from where I'd left it. I was certain I'd aligned it parallel to the edge of the desk. Before leaving at dawn, the early part of the shift passed normally. A few routine calls, Then long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. Around 1 a.m, the lights in the booth flickered without pattern or apparent cause. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Rule 8 came to mind. If the lights flicker 3 times, close your eyes for 30 seconds. I hesitated, feeling foolish, but something about the specific pattern made me uneasy. What harm could it do to follow the rule? I closed my eyes and counted slowly to 30. When I opened them, nothing had changed. The booth looked exactly the same. I laughed nervously at my own gullibility. Then I noticed the handset. It was slightly out of place, though I was certain I'd properly seated it in its cradle after the last call. I reached out to adjust it and my fingers came away damp. The plastic was covered in a thin film of moisture, as if someone with wet hands had recently held it. Throughout the night, the phone would occasionally make soft ringing sounds without actually ringing, a gentle chime that seemed to come from inside the mechanism rather than the bell itself. Each time, I would stare at it, waiting for it to properly ring, but it never did. By morning, my nerves were frayed. I told myself I was being ridiculous, jumping at shadows and imagining things in the quiet isolation of the mountains. But as I drove home, I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a tall figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. Night 4 brought colder weather. A storm front moved in, bringing with it gusting winds that made the glass panels of the booth creak and groan. Rain pelted the roof and sides, creating a cacophony that made it difficult to hear the phone when it rang. The calls were strange that night. One caller simply breathed into the phone for 30 seconds before hanging up. Another asked for directions to a town I'd never heard of, Blackwater Hollow, the same place the elderly woman had mentioned on my first night. When I said I didn't know where that was, the caller laughed softly and said, "It knows you though," before disconnecting. During a lull in the storm, I stepped outside briefly to stretch my legs and clear my head. The forest smelled of rain and pine, clean and refreshing after hours in the small confines of the booth. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something scratched into the metal frame of the door, partially hidden by a hinge. Run before 3:12. The lettering was crude but deliberate, clearly carved with something sharp. I ran my finger over the grooves, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Back inside, I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the clock as it crept toward 3 a.m. The rain returned with a vengeance, sheets of water obscuring the view through the glass walls, turning the outside world into a dark, shifting blur. At 3:10 a.m, the phone began to hum, not ring, but emit a low, steady tone that vibrated through the booth. The lights dimmed slightly, then brightened, then dimmed again. 3:11 a.m. The humming grew louder. I found myself holding my breath. 3:12 a.m. The phone fell silent. The rain seemed to pause, as if the storm itself was holding its breath with me. For the next 4 minutes, I sat perfectly still, watching the second hand on my watch tick by with agonizing slowness. Nothing happened. No calls, no strange sights, no whispers in the dark. At 3:17 a.m, the rain resumed its patter against the glass, and I exhaled a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something, that I'd been tested somehow, and had passed by the simple virtue of doing nothing. On my day off, I visited the local library in the small town 15 miles from the booth. It was a tiny affair, a single room attached to the town hall, with a part-time librarian who seemed surprised to have a visitor. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and grey-streaked hair, raised her eyebrows when I mentioned the telephone booth. "That old thing? Been there since before I was born." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a cardboard box. "These never got digitized. You might find them interesting." Inside were several archived newspapers and a folder of clippings, yellowed with age. I spent hours at a small reading table, piecing together the history of the booth from fragmentary reports and local gossip columns. The articles documented a series of disappearances dating back to the 1970s, all centered around my telephone booth. The disappeared were all attendants, all working the night shift. The most recent was from just 6 months ago, a college student named Michael Thornton who had taken the job for summer cash. His car was found still parked by the booth, keys in the ignition, but Michael himself was never found. Local legends referred to it as the telephone to nowhere. Some claimed it's sometimes connected to places not of this world. One elderly resident, interviewed for a Halloween special feature in 1982, insisted that the booth sat on a thin spot where the barrier between worlds was weak. I dismissed these as small-town superstitions, the kind of folklore that springs up naturally in isolated communities, but a chill ran through me nonetheless, especially when I came across a photograph of the booth from 1976. It looked exactly the same as it did now, not aged a day in nearly 50 years. By the time I left the library, dusk was falling. The librarian touched my arm as I passed her desk. "You're the new attendant, aren't you?" Her eyes held something like pity. "Be careful up there. Some say that booth doesn't just connect calls, it connects places." I forced a laugh. "I'm not much for ghost stories." "Just follow the rules," she said softly. "Whatever you do, follow the rules." I considered quitting then, walking away and never going back. But my bank account wouldn't allow it. My rent was due, and I'd already received a final notice on my electricity bill. Besides, I reasoned, if something terrible had happened to Michael Thornton, wouldn't there be evidence? A struggle, blood, something? I decided to be more cautious, to follow the rules precisely, but to continue working, just until I could find something else, something normal in the city. Night 5. The rulebook had changed. New handwritten notes appeared in the margins, though I was certain they hadn't been there before. Next to Rule 4, someone had scrawled, "They're listening through the line." Beside Rule 1 was a brief addition. "They can only cross over during those 4 minutes." I ran my fingers over the ink. It was completely dry, not freshly written. Yet I was absolutely certain these notes weren't there on my previous shifts. The booth felt different tonight, charged somehow, like the air before a lightning strike. The phone sat in its cradle, innocent looking, yet somehow malevolent in its potential. I found myself reluctant to touch it when it rang. At 2:20 a.m, the phone displayed unknown number. My heart began to race. This was the call from Rule 4. It had to be. Following the rule precisely, I didn't answer, but pressed the speaker button to listen. Faint breathing came through the speaker, rhythmic, calm, like someone sleeping peacefully. I counted to 10, and the call disconnected on its own. I promptly left the booth, locking the door behind me. 5 minutes, the rule said. Exactly 5 minutes. I set a timer on my watch and paced in the small gravel area surrounding the booth, watching my breath form clouds in the cold night air. 4 minutes and 30 seconds in, I heard something moving in the forest. Not the normal sounds of wildlife, but something large pushing through the underbrush. I froze, straining my eyes to see into the darkness between the trees. Nothing visible, but the sounds continued. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy displacing the forest floor. My watch beeped, 5 minutes exact. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run to my car, I followed the rule and returned to the booth. The door stuck slightly, as if someone had locked it, but the key turned and I stepped back inside. The chair had been turned to face the door. The phone cord was twisted into a perfect spiral. I approached the desk cautiously, half expecting the phone to ring. It remained silent. Gingerly, I turned the chair back to its original position and untwisted the cord. As I did so, I noticed a smudge on the inside of the glass wall. A handprint much larger than my own, the fingers unnaturally elongated. I spent the remainder of the shift standing, my back to the desk, watching the forest through the glass walls. The phone didn't ring again that night. By the beginning of week 2, sleep deprivation and constant anxiety had taken their toll. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and I'd lost weight from missed meals and constant stress. I jumped at every sound, both in the booth and at my apartment. Twice I woke from nightmares of being trapped in a glass box while shadowy figures pressed against the outside, their elongated fingers leaving trails in the condensation. I began to notice patterns in the booth's phenomena. The strange occurrences increased in frequency and intensity as the night progressed, peaking just before 3:12 a.m., then tapering off until dawn. The unknown number called exactly once per shift, always at different times. The figures I'd glimpsed that second night had returned, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, circling the booth at a distance, just beyond clear visibility. The calls grew stranger. One night, a child's voice recited what sounded like nursery rhymes in a language I couldn't identify. Another night, a caller simply repeated my name for 2 minutes before disconnecting. Daniel Graves, Daniel Graves, Daniel Graves. I asked how they knew my name. They hung up. A woman called asking about her husband. He worked the booth about 6 months ago. His name is Michael Thornton. Have you seen him? Before I could answer, she added, if you do see him, don't let him in. It's not him anymore. One night, a caller asked for the operator. I remembered Rule 3 and slammed the phone down immediately. The booth's light surged blindingly bright, then dimmed to near darkness before normalizing. For the next hour, I could hear faint voices coming from the handset, even though it was in its cradle. As 3:12 a.m. approached one night, the phone began to emit a low humming sound, though it wasn't ringing. I watched the digital clock tick from 3:12 to 3:13 to 3:14, my hand hovering near the phone, wondering what would happen if I answered during the forbidden time. The phone remained silent, but scratching sounds came from outside the booth, like nails on glass. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, but fresh scratches marred the outside of the glass, horizontal lines about 6 feet up. My obsession with understanding grew. I needed to know what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this all an elaborate prank? Or was something genuinely supernatural occurring at this isolated telephone booth? At a local diner, I casually asked the waitress about the booth while she refilled my coffee. You're the new attendant. She lowered her voice. Be careful about the midnight service. Midnight service? She glanced around nervously. That's what my grandfather called it. He said some places are thin spots where things can cross over. That booth? It's one of them. Cross over from where? He wouldn't say. Just that there are rules to follow and they exist for a reason. She squeezed my shoulder. Don't answer if you hear your own voice. I didn't tell her I'd already broken 2 of the rules, or about the consequences that had followed. That night, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. It shifted under my foot as I paced the small space. When I pried it up, I found a cavity containing a leather-bound journal, a small silver key, and a pocket watch that didn't tick. The journal belonged to Michael Thornton. Its pages were filled with increasingly frantic entries documenting phenomena similar to what I'd experienced but far more intense. Apparitions pressing against the glass. Calls where his deceased grandmother begged to be let in from the cold. The booth relocating slightly overnight, inch by inch, closer to the forest edge. The final entry chilled me. They're using us to cross over. The rules don't protect us, they protect them. They need us to answer to open the door. Don't let them in. The entry was dated exactly 6 months ago. The silver key didn't match any lock in the booth. The pocket watch seemed frozen at 3:14. its second hand trembling slightly, as if trying and failing to advance. I considered not returning for my next shift. I could drive away, back to Denver, find another job. Any job. But something pulled me back. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe something else, something that had been calling to me through the phone line all along. My final night began with purpose. I arrived early, setting up a small digital recorder and a camera borrowed from a pawn shop. If something was happening here, I would document it, prove I wasn't crazy, maybe even solve the mystery of Michael Thornton's disappearance. I also brought supplies, salt, which various folklore claim could repel supernatural entities, a small silver crucifix, and, feeling slightly ridiculous, a can of pepper spray. I had no idea what I might be facing, but it felt better to have some form of defense. I arranged these items on the desk along with the journal, the silver key, and the frozen pocket watch. Then I settled in to wait. Normal calls came until midnight, then nothing for hours. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the heater and my own increasingly ragged breathing. The feeling of being watched intensified until it felt like eyes pressed against every glass panel of the booth, hungry eyes straining to see inside. At 2:45 a.m, unknown number appeared on the caller ID. This was it, the call from Rule 4, but instead of following the rule, I decided to answer, to confront whatever this was. "Who are you?" I demanded, as I lifted the receiver to my ear. "What do you want?" My own voice whispered back, "Run." The line went dead. Immediately the door locked with an audible click. I rushed to it, twisting the handle futilely, then pounding on the glass. The lights began to flicker wildly, strobing like a silent alarm. The phone started ringing non-stop, the display showing different unknown numbers with each ring, cycling too fast to read. The temperature plummeted until frost formed intricate patterns on the windows, not random crystalline formations, but deliberate designs that resembled circuit boards or ancient glyphs. My breath clouded in front of me, and my fingers began to ache with cold. A strange mist filled the booth, swirling from the floor upward, making the glass walls opaque. I couldn't see out anymore, and whatever was out there couldn't see in. I tried to break the door, smashing my shoulder against it repeatedly, but it held firm. The glass was unnaturally solid, as if it had transformed into something stronger. The phenomena intensified as the clock approached 3:12 a.m. The mist thickened until I could barely see the desk 2 feet in front of me. The ringing of the phone became a cacophony of different tones all layered together. Bell rings, electronic chimes, old rotary burrs, even what sounded like whale song. Then, abruptly, silence. The mist parted slightly and I saw the phone receiver lift from its cradle, hovering in mid-air, connected to nothing. Some force pulled me towards it. My hand reached out against my will, grasping the floating receiver. It felt warm against my frozen fingers, almost feverishly hot. A chorus of voices spoke through it, reciting the rules in perfect unison. The effect was chilling. Dozens of voices, male and female, young and old, all speaking together with mechanical precision. Then the voices fell silent and a single voice, mine, spoke clearly. "The booth is a doorway, Daniel, a gateway between worlds, and you've just unlocked it." "Who are you?" I whispered. "I'm you, or I will be, once the transfer is complete." "Transfer?" "We need bodies to cross over. Your world is so substantial. Ours is fading, thinning, becoming less real every day. But we found these thin spots, these places where the boundaries blur. And we found that communication lines, telephone wires, radio waves make perfect conduits. The rules? Designed to prevent accidental crossings, to keep us contained, but they rely on human compliance, on fear, They've worked for decades. But humans are so curious, so rebellious. Someone always breaks the rules eventually. I heard my own laughter echoing from the receiver as darkness swirled around me, thicker than the mist, alive somehow. It coiled around my limbs, my torso, my neck. I've been waiting for you, Daniel. For someone desperate enough to take this job, curious enough to break the rules, and receptive enough to make a perfect host. The darkness took shape, solidifying into a form that mirrored my own, but wasn't quite right. The proportions slightly off, the movements too fluid, as if my reflection had decided to step out of a mirror but hadn't quite gotten the details correct. It reached for me with hands that stretched and elongated, fingers extending like smoke. Don't fight it, your predecessor did, and it only made the process more painful. Michael Thornton. I thought of his journal, his warning. Had he faced this same entity wearing his face? The silver key. For some reason that thought pushed through my terror. The key that didn't fit any lock in the booth. As the darkness closed around me, I fumbled in my pocket where I'd placed the key for safekeeping. My fingers closed around it just as the entity's elongated hand clamped over my mouth, muffling my scream. The key burned hot in my hand, scalding my palm. Acting on instinct, I pressed it against the entity's wrist. A shriek tore through the booth, high-pitched and inhuman. The dark form recoiled, its shape distorting like smoke in a wind tunnel. The pocket watch. It had fallen to the floor in the struggle. Its hands were moving now, spinning rapidly, counter-clockwise. The entity shrieked again, its form unravelling at the edges. I dove for the watch, snatching it from the floor. The second hand stopped abruptly at 3:12, and the booth filled with a blinding white light. I felt as if I was being turned inside out. My consciousness stretched and compressed simultaneously. The booth seemed to expand around me, the glass walls receding into infinite distance even as they pressed in claustrophobically close. The last thing I saw was the rulebook falling open, a new entry forming on the page as if written by an invisible hand. If you hear your own voice, it's already too late. The darkness swallowed me whole. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the telephone booth, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. The booth stood empty, clean, with no sign of struggle or disturbance. A car pulled up on the gravel. The thin manager emerged, carrying a small sign. Help wanted, telephone booth attendant, night shift, good pay. He placed it carefully on the door before checking the interior. Everything was in order. The rulebook lay open on the desk. A new entry, clearly visible, at the bottom of the page, written in handwriting that didn't match the previous notes. The manager picked up the pocket watch that lay beside the book. The hands pointed to 3:14, frozen in place. He wound it carefully, but the second hand refused to move. As he set it down, he noticed something on the floor. A small silver key. Its surface blackened, as if burned. He pocketed it. Without expression, a young woman approached from another car, smiling hopefully. Is this about the job? I saw it posted online. The manager nodded, ushering her inside. He handed her the rulebook. Everything you need to know is in here. The job is simple. Maintain the booth, answer calls, follow the rules. What happened to the last attendant? She asked, glancing around the pristine booth. Found a better opportunity, the manager said, his face expressionless. They always do. As she flipped through the pages, the phone began to ring. The manager left quietly, closing the door behind him. Through the glass, he watched as the new attendant reached for the receiver. His reflection in the glass showed a face that wasn't quite his own, the features slightly wrong, the smile too wide, the eyes too dark. Inside his pocket, his fingers closed around the silver key. Unlike the pocket watch, this was proving harder to neutralize. No matter how many times he burned it, melted it down, buried it deep in the forest floor, it always returned to the booth, appearing in unexpected places. One day an attendant would figure out its true purpose, but until then, the booth would continue its midnight service, connecting worlds that were never meant to touch, allowing passage for those patient enough to wait for curious, desperate humans to break the rules. He returned to his car, adjusting the rearview mirror. Daniel Graves' face looked back at him, but the eyes belonged to something much older, something that had worn many faces over many decades. "Follow the rules," he whispered to no one in particular, "or don't. We'll be waiting either way."